Welcome to Mahoning Drive-In Radio. This is Mark. You may know me as the friendly neighborhood snack bar cashier, the man who touches your money, not your food, just your money, while at the drive-in. So sit back, relax, and get ready to delve deeply into the wonderful world of drive-in cinema. Specifically the Mahoning Drive-In, but, also drive-ins in general, and movies in general, because isn't that kind of why we're all here? So for me, my relationship with the drive-in goes back, like many of us, to being a little kid. My parents took me to the drive-in. It was one of 3 options we had to see movies in the small New Hampshire town that I grew up in. For me, it was the Claremont Drive-In. I have very, very fond memories of going to this drive-in as a wee lad. I think probably the earliest I can remember was probably 1977, so I would have been 3 years old. I specifically remember seeing the Apple Dumpling Gang Rides Again at the drive-in. I remember Harry Morgan's face splashed across the giant drive-in screen from the backseat of my parents' car, and I remember so many things about the drive-in. When you're little, everything sort of makes that big impression in your brain. I remember the pinkish purple neon letter C on the drive-in marquee that was outside the theater facing the road behind the screen where all the film titles would be put up every week. I remember driving under the overhang at the ticket booth, and that sort of, in my brain, memory at least, the sort of slanted glass that they used to have in that old style that you see in a lot of surviving hamburger stands and ice cream shops now. But back then they would put it everywhere, really. And I remember the sound of tires crunching on gravel. To me, that is one of the most quintessential drive-in sounds, is that gentle crunch as the car tires roll up the ramp and into place, or they roll out for the night. And back in my day, back when I was a kid, we still had speakers. At my drive-in in Claremont, New Hampshire, back in the late 70s, early 80s, that drive-in closed in 87. Back then, they still had the speakers functional. Now, there were areas where the speakers would break, and, it got to a point where the drive-ins weren't really wanting to pay to maintain the speakers anymore, or there wasn't the ability to maintain the speakers. So as they died and became dysfunctional, they would just take them out. And parallel to the speakers, I do recall you having the option to listen over the radio. It was the typical kind of fuzzy AM shortwave radio. Shortwave meaning it didn't cover much. Well, actually, no, it did cover Beyond the Lot, because another memory I have clearly is leaving the drive-in one night, and we lived clear across town. We lived a good way away from the drive-in, and I remember us leaving after the second movie, and we could still hear the credits far, far away. And in fact, I remember the plaza, the drive-in was located next to the Kmart plaza in my town, and I remember leaving Kmart one night and trying to see if we could tune in the drive-in, and you could, and I remember being able to hear the movie almost all the way home, and that's like miles and miles away. So it was really impressive to me that the signal from the drive-in, which really only needed to cover not a very big lot, really. I mean, it was sizable, but it was nowhere near as big as the Mahoning lot, that signal would go so far. And indeed, at the Mahoning, I have had times where I would be coming to work a little bit late from another event on a show night, and I could hear the intermission reel playing between films. I think I was at Pizza Hut in Lehighton. I was driving past it, and it first started to come in, and I could tell how much time I had. I could tell if I would get there in time to run and be behind the register for the snack bar, or get there in time to see the second movie, based on the fact that I could hear the broadcast from that far away. And that was pretty cool. And it's always made me wonder if people who live near drive-in theaters ever tune into the frequency and kind of just listen to the movie. Maybe that was more common back in the old days, back when, radio was, in theater of the mind was more of a thing. But I always thought, man, if I lived near a drive-in, I would listen to the movies all the time. And indeed, back in 1987, the last year the drive-in didn't open in my town, my family moved across town to a place where I figured I could ride my bike, not a very far distance, park it on the hillside that overlooked the drive-in. And if I brought a radio, I could sit there and watch movies for free, and I was so excited about that. And even sort of a step below that, I was excited with the idea that, man, if I could get that radio on my stereo in my bedroom, I could listen to movies for free. I could listen to new movies. Now, nowadays you think about that and you're like, well, why would you want to just listen to a movie? But back then, home video was still relatively fresh. The idea of being able to own a movie was still fresh. I remember kids just a couple of years earlier than that, they would hold tape recorders up to the TV and they record movies that way, because that was the only way you knew you were going to be able to listen to it again or see it again or hear it again, because it was the era of $100 videotapes. And unless you were rich or smart enough to have 2 VCRs and do a little illegal duping at home from the rental store, you really weren't going to have the ability to, as we say now, have a movie on demand quite so much. So I was really excited when we moved in 87 that I was going to be that much closer to our drive-in. Unfortunately, that was the year the drive-in was, so the land that the drive-in sat upon, the fate of so many drive-ins, was sold, and it was basically bulldozed to become a Kmart. It was bulldozed to become a Kmart built right next door to the Kmart we already had. So I was like forever resentful about that. I was like, we already have one. The drive-in is unique. It's cool. It's close to my house now. Why are you doing this? And, and then, what happened? Sure enough, that Kmart went out of business. Now, it went out of business about 30 years later, but still, I hold. It would have been cooler to have the drive-in all that time. Anyway, I digress as often as possible. I don't have a lot of clear memories of going into the snack bar as a kid. I think my parents were the type to probably have us eat dinner before we went out to the drive-in because it wasn't that long a drive from where we lived. And they weren't the type that would really get there tremendously early. I always remember us getting a pretty good spot, being 2 or 3 rows back, sort of parallel with the entranceway to the drive-in snack bar. So I think we would have eaten dinner first. We always brought a cooler, and I actually still have the cooler, the old 70s red and white igloo cooler that we used to bring to the drive-in as a kid. I still have, and I still occasionally will bring to drive-ins now, and that's a pretty cool, for me, connection to the past. But one of the biggest things I remember from being a kid at the drive-in, and one of the things that I actually looked forward to almost as much as the movies, was the intermission reel.
It's time to stretch and fetch. See what's cooking at our refreshment counter.
Now, this was, if you're a fan of drive-in culture, you know there were many intermission reels, and everybody who went to a drive-in, their local would show one. Usually they only had one. Occasionally a drive-in would have a couple, like we have at the Mahoning. Jeff has several that he rotates through. Some are big fans of certain ones. I know Rico gets a lot of love.
See?
I know Puppies and Kitties gets a lot of love. And every once in a while, he'll acquire a new one and add that to the rotations, which is kind of cool because you don't know which one you're going to get when you go there. And if you go often enough, you'll see your favorite or all your favorites. But at the Claremont Drive-In when I was a kid back in the 70s, early 80s, they just had one. And it was the one that was a countdown reel and had the little animated bits and pieces. You had the little marching band, the guy playing the tuba.
5 minutes to go.
And you had my personal favorite, the golfer and his lady, which is, I think, is extremely untoward, and I love it. There's a very well-placed sound effect in there, okay? And that, to me, as a kid, was exciting because anytime, this was, again, back in my day, yeah, cartoons were on all the time, but I still savored any chance I could get to see something animated. So down to seeing the Pink Panther movies, and in fact, one of the movies I remember seeing at the drive-in as a kid was the Pink Panther Strikes Again. And the animated intros to those were so cool. The opening title sequences with the titular Pink Panther. And being able to see this little animated thing during the intermission every time was really cool to me. And it wasn't until years later I ever was able to see that again when I started going to the Northfield Drive-In. It's actually literally on the border between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, runs through the drive-in lot. And they played that there. And I was just like, oh my God, I haven't seen this since I was a kid. And this would have been the 90s. So this was a decade or better later. I was able to see it again. And it makes me so happy that we have that at the Mahoning, and that's one that Jeff runs. Because, so much of what we love about the drive-in is about nostalgia, and being able to re-experience something that was this fleeting thing as a kid on the regular is pretty sweet. And in fact, it's one of those things where you're chasing that nostalgia and you're chasing that feeling again to make you feel like you did back then when times were simpler or seemed to be simpler to you. And in fact, now I've seen that intermission reel dozens more times than I ever did when I was a kid, and it's still kind of a thrill every time.
How do you like your pizza? Gobbled? Nibbled? Two-fisted style.
One thing I wanted to talk about was this memory I have of going to a specific show at the drive-in, the double feature of The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia and Honeysuckle Rose. Little backstory on these films. So Honeysuckle Rose was a film from 1980, which was the big Willie Nelson movie. It was Willie Nelson and Diane Cannon, and the song On the Road Again was in this film, and it was a sizable hit. Certainly the song was. And it was just a story about, Willie Nelson's this country guy on the road and the lives and loves and laughs that he has being on the road, being Willie. And that was released in 1980. The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia is something that you saw a bit of in the early 80s and the late 70s. It was a movie that was based on a song. It was based on the Vicki Lawrence from the Carol Burnett Show song, The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia, that was a big hit in the 70s. So 1981 rolls around and it becomes a movie starring Christy McNichol, Dennis Quaid, and Mark Hamill. I remember seeing the TV ads, the TV spots for that movie, and it had Luke Skywalker in it, and he played a cop. And there's a scene in the ads where he walks up to pull somebody over, and he's in his underwear, and he's got red polka-dotted boxers. And oh my God, this movie looks great and funny, and I need to go see this.
In case you haven't guessed, sweet little Christy McNichol isn't that little anymore. In The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia.
You're crazier than I am, you know that?
Christy McNichol, Dennis Quaid, Mark Hamill.
Well, I think you got a few things to learn.
So you gonna teach me, Mr. State Trooper?
I just might.
He's got the talent. She's got the brain. Together, they're one mean team. In The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia.
So I start begging my mother to take me to see Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia at the drive-in. Didn't care about Honeysuckle Rose. I think maybe my mother was more interested in Honeysuckle Rose because it was more of a grown-up movie and she probably thought Willie Nelson was cool. And so I was begging, please take me to go to see this. This is coming to the drive-in. And at the time, this drive-in, which some would do, it would flip-flop the order of the movies. So the way they had it scheduled for this weekend, it was, I believe it was during the summertime. So it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Could be totally wrong. It's been, 40 years since this happened. But my memory is this. On Friday, the lineup started with Honeysuckle Rose and then followed by Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. On Saturday, it was going to be the same thing, and on Sunday they would swap them. So on Sunday, if you just wanted to see the movie that I wanted to see, you could go and see that first, followed by Honeysuckle Rose. Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia, followed by Honeysuckle Rose. And it was kind of a cool way to mix things up. So that's the way they were doing it. And my mother said, okay, you have two options. We go Friday, and you have to watch Honeysuckle Rose first, and then we watch Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. Or we go Saturday, and you get the movie you want to see first. And I was an impatient child. I was a mega Star Wars fan. I had thrown a tantrum the year before to get the Star Wars Christmas album, which I never really listened to after I got it, but still, I have it. So being impatient, I couldn't wait. So I'm like, oh, no, we have to go Friday. I can't wait to see this. I can't wait to see it. It's got Luke Skywalker and he's in his underwear. Oh my God. Not in a sexual way, but it looked like wacky comedy with Luke Skywalker. And, at the time, Mark Hamill wasn't working a tremendous lot. He had done Corvette Summer after Star Wars and maybe some other things. But, if you were a Star Wars maniac like I was, you really only had those movies and they in theaters. They weren't on video and they weren't on TV at that point to see this character or this actor in. So I was probably less than patient about it verbally. So we went out on Friday night and we paid our tickets and we got our spot and we sat through Honeysuckle Rose, which as a kid was really not what I was into, but it was fine. I remember it being kind of funny and pleasant and the music was fine. And then intermission comes, and this is really cool. And then they show the Tom and Jerry cartoon. And I'm like, oh man, this is so great. They never show cartoons at this drive-in. This is fantastic. I've never seen a theatrical cartoon on the big screen. This was all stuff that I only had ever seen on TV. This is great. And they keep showing more and more stuff during intermission that they normally wouldn't. Kind of old stuff that they normally wouldn't. They show a Jimmy Fund appeal from like the 40s. This black and white reel where somebody's talking to the audience saying, ushers are going to be coming around to your cars to collect for the Jimmy Fund. And even as the, 7-year-old kid that I was at the time, I remember thinking, they're stalling. Something is not right here. The intermissions don't usually go on this long. And I remember my grandmother and my mother sort of opening up their purses to find change to hand out to the ushers. And I'm sitting in the back seat and I say, there's nobody coming around to the cars. Something's going on here. And finally, somebody came on, the projectionist came on over the intercom or over the speakers and said, the print of Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia hasn't shown up yet. So if you want to leave and get a rain check, you can. If you want to stay, we still have Flash Gordon, which we had been showing the previous week, if that's okay. Otherwise, you're welcome to leave and come back tomorrow or Sunday night, and we're really sorry. Now, I was just pissed. I was a kid who I want to see The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. And by the way, this little story will probably go down in podcast history as the most times that film has ever been mentioned in the course of an hour since it came out. I didn't want to stay and watch Flash Gordon. I thought Flash Gordon looked scary. Now, as a 6 or 7 year old, I mean, now I think it's a blast, but as a 6 or 7 year old, they would always show that weird spider creature in the swamp in the trailers, and I thought that looked scary, and I didn't want to be there to see that. So I have a clear memory of my grandmother and mother, getting their stuff together and putting the car in gear and rolling out while the Queen theme to Flash Gordon plays in the cool animated opening. And I thought it looked cool, but it's like, oh, that's not the movie I want to see. I want to see this other thing. So that was that, and we went home that night. So the next day rolls around, and my mother says, okay, you can go and see the same 2 movies that we were supposed to see last night tonight, but you're going to have to wait through the first feature again to see the movie you want to see. Or if we wait until Sunday, you can go there and you can see the movie you wanted to see first, finally, and not have to watch the Willie Nelson saga again. And of course, being the patient, thoughtful child that I was, I said, no, I want to go tonight. I want to see the movie I want to see. I don't want to wait. So we went out, and I remember we went to Burger King and had dinner. And then it was very close to the drive-in. It was almost across the street, just up the street. And then we rolled in again, and we sat through Honeysuckle Rose again. And I heard On the Road again another dozen times, or however many times it's played in the movie. And intermission came up, and oh, here we go. I'm so excited. I'm awake now. I'm ready to go. Oh my God, I'm finally going to see this movie that we've gone through all these trials and tribulations and had to get a rain check to see. And the movie starts, and it's the song, and there's his name. It's Mark Hamill on the big screen, and this movie's kind of funny and kind of down home. And I fell asleep. I fell asleep, and I never saw the rest of it. And I was awakened as we were leaving, and the credits were rolling. And I never saw that whole movie. After all the moaning and being a little brat that I was to see The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia back there in 1981, I never really saw the whole movie until it hit HBO a little bit later that year. Then I watched it over and over again. And funny enough, it's one of those PG movies. PG used to be this wide-ranging or much wider-ranging rating in what they would allow in it. There's full frontal nudity in like the opening of that movie, like full frontal female. And I'm just like, wow, that's a PG movie. Full frontal and a character is shot to death in a very not funny way in that movie. One of those movies too that made me fear for, it made me distrustful of a lot of dramas as a kid, even though it was sort of a light drama, because so many dramas that I watched as a kid on TV, Bless the Beasts and Children being the big one, were these movies that were like all fun in the sun and fun and games, and all these characters are great, and then one of them's dead. And I wasn't a fan of that, so that actually kept me away from dramas for a long time. Anyway, years later, a local video store was getting rid of all of their VHS tapes, and they were like a really cool indie video, like big-time regional video superstore, and they were just giving out their videotapes for free. And this was more recently than you'd expect a place to have VHS, really, just a few years ago. And I was able to snag free copies of Honeysuckle Rose and The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. So one day soon, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to recreate the double feature I never fully got when I was 7 years old.
If you're mighty thirsty for something mighty good, our hot chocolate's just a drink. It's a beverage and a food. Get hot chocolate and see just how good a drink can be.
So speaking of throwbacks, so what we do at the Mahoning, as you probably know, is we are all 35 millimeter, all retro. So it is recreating the past. It is stepping back in time. It is wallowing in the good memories and making new ones, obviously. A lot of people are seeing movies for the first time this way, which to me, the best way to see a film for the first time, no matter what it is on the big screen. I will never enjoy anything as much as I do seeing it large and in charge, especially on the Mahoning screen, which is 110 feet of CinemaScope glory. And an interesting thing about the Mahoning screen, if you look at it dead on, you can still sort of see where the original screen that was built in 1948, opened in 1949, built in 1948, it was square. It was 4:3, Academy ratio, 1:3:3, because that's how movies were shaped back in 49 when the lights first hit that screen. Eventually, CinemaScope came in, and in the 50s, the screen was basically wings were attached to the screen, and it made it the widescreen glory that it is. And speaking of the history of the Mahoning, a little project I'm working on for our Patreon followers that you'll get maybe a taste of here at Mahoning Drive-In Radio, and I think I'll be doing some video segments with that as well, is going back through old newspaper listings and finding out what the theater played back in the old days. And typically now, our season goes last weekend in April to last weekend in October, which is a little bit farther out than some theaters go as far as their operating schedules. Some are open year-round. Some in the Midwest. I've always been very jealous of people who live anywhere that has drive-ins that are just always open, whether it's in warmer climates or places where they're just like, yeah, run your heater. It's snowing. Who cares? It's a movie on the screen. We go end of April, always start with Wizard of Oz and Willy Wonka traditionally, and go till Halloween weekend, have a big Halloween party like we did this year. But the first year the Mahoning was open, they didn't have a set pattern yet of how they did it. And in fact, the first year the Mahoning was open, they were open until a bit into November. Basically, I think their idea was that they would just stay open until people didn't show up anymore, or it was just too cold to run the shows. So I have in front of me here from the Mauch Chunk Times News, which was the paper of record for the area, the last show of the season for the original Mahoning Drive-In Theater. 4 miles west of Lehighton, the ads were always sure to point out, the original season, the first inaugural season. So the last night of the 1949 season was Sunday, November 13th, and it was a double feature. And the films they had were Tyrone Power in Blood and Sand, which was a drama about bullfighters, and Randolph Scott and Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews in the movie called Belle Starr, a Western. And it's interesting to see, when you look at this is 1949. That double feature features two 20th Century Fox movies that were both 8 years old at that point. And again, these are the days before really much of the way of movies on TV. Not a lot of folks had TV in 1949, and the studios for many years were very reluctant to sell their films to TV. So the only way to see a movie was in the theater, really. And you had re-releases. You know, they would re-release the Universal Monster movies every once in a while. These are classics that people would look forward to, you know, a generation. It's sort of the process Disney had for many years of re-releasing their classics on the big screen. I saw Darby O'Gill and the Little People on the big screen on film as a kid, and that movie was, you know, probably approaching 20 years old at that point. But to me, I'd never seen it, but it was a new movie to me. So you have a double feature with these two movies from 8 years earlier, from 1941, and they're pretty typical of what the Mahoning was running back in the early days. Now, this, you know, my research has just begun, but what I'm seeing is that the indoor theaters, there was an indoor theater called the Capitol in Jim Thorpe nearby. There was, or Mauch Chunk at that point. There was the Palace, not too far away. There were a couple of indoor theaters, and those were the theaters that generally played what we would call the A pictures. They would play the big Hollywood all-star cast films, and they would play the horror movies too. Now, people talk about drive-in movies, and they always think drive-ins are horror movies and sci-fi and schlock and all that, and they certainly were, and they certainly in some areas became that. But for many years, drive-ins were showing family films and just normal movies. And most of what I'm seeing in the research for the first several years of the Mahoning is that they were showing a lot of Westerns, a lot of crime movies, melodramas, and what you would call B pictures, but in the classic sense of B picture, as in not the A-level movie, but the one that's a little bit below that, not like schlocky stuff. Now, on occasion, they would show that stuff. And I'll talk more about that in future throwback segments. But for the most part, the Mahoning just ran normal stuff for normal people, which is what I refer to, not condescendingly or anything, not insultingly at all. But when you talk about the Mahoning crowd. The Mahoning crowd loves horror movies. They love retro movies. They love schlock. They love the immersive experience we have. And you have people who just want to see the new Tom Hanks movie, and that's fine. You have people who just want to see the new mainstream stuff, which is, you know, what the indoor theater up the street used to do, and that's fine. I always refer to those people as normal people, because normal people generally don't want to see some of the kind of shows we put on, and that's fine. That's fine. It's not saying that our people are abnormal. I'm just saying normal people want other stuff. So the Mahoning classically was always a drive-in for normal people. And then our gang took over. It became a drive-in for abnormal people. But it's very interesting to go through these old ads and see how the theater found its footing in the early days, how they advertised themselves, what kind of films they showed, what kind of promotional things they did. It's fascinating, and it's not all A pictures. It's not all B pictures. There were some Z pictures in there, and I'll bring that up and tell you about those as we go. And we'll post these ads too. We'll post them alongside the video segment or the podcast where we talk about them, so you can get a look yourself too. But to me, it's just fascinating. It's a wonderful step back in time, like the Mahoning is. Built in 1948, opened in 1949, and not a heck of a lot has changed in that amount of time. Various owners have upgraded and tweaked and modified things slightly here and there. But if you take the in-depth, the insider's VIP tour, you're going to find so much there that has not really been touched since it was laid in that swampy ground decades ago. So I don't know how familiar you are with radio spots. I'm a huge fan of radio spots. I grew up in the era where I grew up, you never really heard them, but these were things that were created to be played on radio stations. As much as you would have a TV commercial for a movie, there were audio versions of that were crafted for radio stations, and stations would get them. They would come on a 45. It's the kind of thing that a theater would order and then I think hand off to the radio station and pay to play. Not payola, but actually, you're paying for a commercial. And some were basically just cut down versions of the trailer, but some were their own art form. Some were really designed to work as an audio piece. Some had nothing to do with the movie at all in terms of audio. It would just be an announcer or other actors talking about things or music or sound effects or whatever. But I think they're fascinating. They're highly entertaining. You'll hear Virgil play them sometimes during his DJ sets at the drive-in to spice things up. Mostly horror because that's our bread and butter, but they really were done for every genre of film. You can occasionally find these on eBay. They're pretty collectibles, so it's kind of hard to find any for really well-known films. I've got one myself for a movie called The Man from AIP in, I think, the early 70s, late 60s, which is a film about this shocking, unthinkable idea that an African-American might become president one day, starring James Earl Jones. And it's got the AIP logo on it. And I'm a huge American International Pictures fan. So to have anything vintage with their name on it, to me, is a treasure to have. So what we're going to occasionally do here at Mahoning Drive-In Radio, much like we do in the booth if you're on the lot, is play you some radio spots. We'll throw one in every now and again. We may announce it, we may talk about it, we may just throw it in to spice up the program. But here's one right now that is one of my absolute favorites. This is the radio spot for a movie called Shockwaves. Now, we're going to talk about movies here, and we're going to talk about how we first saw movies and nostalgia and history and all that stuff, or at least I am. And one of the movies that really creeped me out royally when I was a kid was this movie from 1977, starring Peter Cushing, called Shockwaves. And it's basically the underwater Nazi zombie movie. Now, there have been other Nazi zombie movies. There have been other underwater Nazi zombie movies, but there's only one Shockwaves. And it does something I love in horror that few films do, or few films try to do or do well. And it's something I call daylight horror. Phantasm has a little bit of that too. And that is something creepy happening in broad daylight. Something is coming at you and you can see it clearly coming at you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And how do you react to that? So Shockwaves basically is a boatload of people, small boat featuring Brooke Adams. They crash on this island that seems to be uninhabited, but Peter Cushing is there, and he's some weird, scraggly old Nazi scientist who's been there since the war, and you find out he has been working on this, or he had been working on this program to reanimate the dead and use them as basically super soldiers. And there are all of these scenes of these zombies with Nazi uniforms on underwater, rising up out of the water and going after people. And it just was creepy as a kid. And it might be cheesy now. I don't know. I think I'm too close to it to really know whether it's good or not, but I like it. And in the old days, ballyhoo was king. Ad men, agencies, producers, they sold the sizzle and not the steak. They came up with great taglines, the great ad campaigns, great visuals. Keep telling yourself it's only a movie, stuff like that. And for me, Shockwaves has a pretty good line in it. So here's the original radio spot for Shockwaves.
Something is down there. Something unspeakable. Something that once was almost human. Shockwaves. Something from beneath the living. Something to chill you to the deep. Shockwaves. From Joseph Brenner, rated PG. Starring the masters of shock, Peter Cushing and John Carradine. Shockwaves. It is something else.
And if I'm not mistaken, it's kind of a blur at this point, but if I'm not mistaken, Exhumed ran Shockwaves at one of the Zombie Fests years ago, and I'm a big fan of that movie. I would be happy to have us see that film hit our screen once more in the future. So I think that's going to do it for me right now. I just wanted to pop in for a little while, a little visit, tell you a story, give you a little information, give you an idea of sort of what Mahoning Drive-In Radio is going to be like. It's really going to be all sorts of things. It's going to be somewhat like you get when you're at the drive-in. You'll hear us talking. You'll hear people you know from the theater talking. We'll interview each other. You get to know the staff a little bit more. We'll interview guests who come through. We'll interview guests who maybe haven't been to the drive-in yet. We'll talk to other drive-in owners about their experiences, get their stories. We'll get some history with Jeff. We'll get some inside information about upcoming events that you might not know about yet. And it's just sort of like it's a way to extend the Mahoning Drive-In experience for people who might not have been to the theater or can't get to the theater, or for times when the theater isn't open. It's a way to stay connected in the off-season and stay super connected in the on-season.
Dog days, hot dog days that is, somehow have a way of turning out to be fun days. The pop and sizzle of the juicy meat seems to say, come and get me, I'm done to a turn.
And I just want to take just a little moment to thank you for being part of Patreon. If this is how you're listening to this, thank you very much. We have 3 levels on Patreon, 3 different price levels, 3 different tiers, and it gets you different stuff. No matter which level you're at, we just thank you for helping support the theater. The whole idea with this Patreon is a way to generate income in the off-season and keep the lights on, keep the film rolling, and continue the fun here at the Mahoning in a way that we really couldn't do completely before. And it's a way to just stay connected with everybody and give a little something extra for the Insiders Club, so to speak. So thank you so much, and we will talk to you again very, very soon on Mahoning Drive-In Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for coming out tonight to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. We hope you'll come back and see us again real soon. The exit is on the right-hand side of the screen at the front of the field. Good night and God bless you.